Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, with producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. For its October novel, the Providence College Alumni Book Club chose a title from a genre appropriate for the season, horror. The book, Survivor Song, is written by Paul Tremblay, a member of the class of 1993, and features the suspense and terror that has become the Bram Stoker award-winning author's trademark. We join the book club discussion as Tremblay describes how he invented a virus, which is the main subject of his unexpectedly timely story.
I actually listened to the audiobook while walking my dog. I feel like I was testing the fates with rabies there, but we survived. So anyway, like rabies is just this nutty virus that no other virus really acts like rabies. You know, it's not bloodborne, so there's no blood test for rabies. If you get bitten by something with rabies, it attaches directly to your nerve and crawls up the nervous system until it gets into your brain. And there's no way to know if you have rabies until it passes through the brain barrier. The unfortunate part is you don't show any symptoms until it passes through the brain barrier. So I knew that my sort of, infected zombie-ish rabies was perfect for what I wanted to do. So that's where that came from. And I mentioned so that was July of 2018. I handed in my book to my publisher of August 2019. My final edits returned in October. So the timeliness part of it, I figured, I didn't think an epidemic or a pandemic was timely. I wanted to set it in the now time. I figured maybe how the people reacted to it would seem realistic. But I had no idea how realistic that was going to become.
Absolutely. Well, that's incredible how that worked out.
Yeah, I would have preferred not to have the pandemic, honestly, for many reasons, obviously. But yeah, no, it's been, I think it's been strange for everybody. I think it's been a little bit extra strange just to put out a pandemic book during a pandemic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, picking up off of that, what stood out to you as particularly unique, rewarding, or challenging with this project overall in comparison to some of the other works that you've done?
Sure. So, for me, this book felt a lot different than my previous novels, for sure, because my previous novels all played with like a supernatural ambiguous element, and this was going to have no ambiguity. I didn't want to be writing the same book over and over again. So I knew that going into the book that now there was going to be sort of an answer, and there was going to be no supernatural element. So that was part of it. That was the hard part for me, was I had to do research, and I hate research. I was a math major at Providence College, so no one taught me how to do proper research in college. I'm not going to blame my math teachers, who really don't have to do a lot of math research. So that was hard. The most rewarding part was that a lot of the medical, well, not the rabies part of it, but I really dug into what the local response to a virus like this would be. No, I didn't want to go national, like global response. I really wanted to home in on the local level. And my sister, she's only 1 year younger than me. She's a nurse at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, which is one of the biggest hospitals in Boston. And so she was a huge help. She actually got me like the hospital's response plan. But weirdly, I think the thing that made the book feel, I think, prescient to people who read it is I took my sister's experience in 2014 when there was an Ebola outbreak, mainly in Africa, but there was, there were some patients in the United States as well. And her hospital said, hey, we're going to take Ebola patients, and this is our plan. And they only sent them like a PDF and a PowerPoint. And my sister was freaking out, rightly so. And they talked about how they weren't going to have hazmat suits, that you're going to have to double gown up and like duct tape. So for anyone who's read the book, the scene where Dr. Ramola is texting back and forth with her coworkers, those texts were borrowed from my sister and her friends. Like they had a text chain about Ebola. And I remember vividly, I rewrote the texts, but using those, I remember vividly writing in those texts, like PPE, how much do I have to define that more than once? I think I'll just, I'll say what PPE stands for once and leave it be, obviously never knowing that PPE would become, part of our cultural language now. So yeah, the most rewarding part is I got to work on a book with my sister, who's, one of my best friends. So that was amazing. But then obviously when COVID hit, it mixed up my feelings of the book because, now I'm just like so worried about her because I know what she has to go through and what all other, health providers, healthcare workers have to go through. So, it added just more weirdness to the book for my experience anyway.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. It's been really interesting to see how everything has unfolded. Now, part of the mystery and fascination with the book lies in the title. Could you tell us a little bit about your process for selecting the title?
Sure. If it's a novel, I typically start with a title, or not start. I try to have one before I start writing. I've written a novel without a title once. It was such a miserable experience trying to come up with a title afterwards. So that's my 2-bit advice. If you're gonna write a novel, have a title first. But weirdly, so Survivor Song, that was there at the beginning for me. And what that meant to me is I'm a big music fan, nerd, still am. I worked at DOM when I was at Providence, and that was one of the, the most fun things I did in college. And I'm always taking inspiration from song titles or from lyrics and songs. Anyway, so when I was calling the Survivor Song, that meant to me is here's a book that to me was going to be one of my favorite, I don't know, punk, alternative, indie type songs that I still like. This book was going to take place really only over 4 to 6 hours. I wanted it to be a quick, compressed timeline. And I know a lot of my favorite songs are both weirdly a mix of aggressive, sad, and hopeful. And that was kind of the vibe I was trying to go for with the book. I'll tell you weirdly, so when I finished the book and turned it into my publisher, the sales team was like, we don't like the title Survivor Song. I'm like, what? I set it up even parts of the book are named after parts of songs. I'm like, it's kind of a big deal. But they're like, can you come up with something else? Fine. So I gave them another title, You Will Not Feel Me Between Your Teeth, which is a slight twist on a line from the Grimm's fairy tales of Snow White. And I was like, ooh, I love that title now. It ended up being a title of one of the sections of the book. But then the publisher and the sales people were like, it's good, but we don't want teeth in the title, I guess thinking that would scare away readers. So they went back to Survivor Song. And I was weirdly kind of unhappy about it. I was like, no, wait a minute. This is the first title that you wanted in the first place. So yeah, titles can be fun and not fun.
So sticking to our instincts is definitely something to hang on to, huh?
I try.
So your characters are quite relatable and realistic, and I felt almost instantly connected to them and invested in their world. What message are you intending to send with the characterization?
So some of characterization stuff in general for me, it depends on the story, right? That's sort of, it took me a long time to figure that out. I've been messing around with writing since, I don't know, the mid to late 90s. Then it was only really a hobby for me. But so it's been a long process to get to where I feel like whatever little things I feel like I know, it's taken me years to get there. And the biggest thing for me is to serve the story. Everything has to serve the story first. But typically, especially these characters, I always try to start from a place of empathy. I take that job seriously as a writer, particularly of a writer of fiction. Because I'm also a teacher, and I've read so many different academic studies that say people who read fiction have typically have a stronger ability to empathize than people who don't read fiction. And that makes sense to me because you're reading about people who aren't you. So, I take that empathy side of things, very seriously, even for characters who aren't the quote unquote, who might be the villains in a particular story. I don't know. I think empathy is a powerful thing, especially in horror. The idea that you want to understand what another character is doing, even if they're doing something very distasteful. I think that's a really interesting thing that you can explore. And in this novel in particular, I knew it, since it was such over a compressed timeline, I wasn't going to be doing a big sprawling novel where we jump into 15 different people. We've seen that sort of zombie horror novel done 1,000 times. So it really was going to be Romola's and Natalie's novel. So I really felt like I had to really sort of dig in and do my best to make them as characters. And so I really appreciate that you connected with them. And I don't know, insofar as like where they come from, I wanted Romola to reflect, the reality of this New England area. I mean, most of the doctors, at least in the Boston area, look like Romola. They come from other countries. I didn't want to just like stick someone, who looks like me as Romola's character kind of thing. So those are some of the decisions that you make, in the early part of the book. And then it's kind of cool that like once you set up like these very broad strokes of your characters, and then, letting them say things and do things, which sounds kind of goofy, but really their character comes out of what they say and what they do, right? I don't know, sorry, it's a big rambly answer.
It's a perfect answer. Thank you. And in addition to the characterization, the details are just vividly captured. And although, many moments are intense, it was impossible to stop turning the pages. So how would you say you're innovating the horror novel space with your writing in particular?
Oh, well, thank you again. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm innovating, but I guess part of what I try to do, one of them is what I talked about a little bit about trying to, it's not the only way to do a horror story, obviously, but to have almost all the characters, be treated with a sense of empathy. Because again, I think, once those characters are sort of placed in obviously dangerous situations, I think, that can make the reader really feel and really be moved is ultimately what I want. I think what I mentioned a little bit earlier too has sort of become, I don't want to say my shtick or my bag, but like the idea that I'm trying to make something as realistic as possible. Like, I think part of that might be the math part of me is like, this can't really happen in real life, but no, how could I make it seem like really close to it actually being able to happen in real life? I don't know. And part of that's just me as like always someone who dwells on, I'm a scaredy cat, a card carrying scaredy cat, still like partially afraid of the dark. If I'm home all by myself at night, I'm not above sleeping with the light on. And someone who dwells on worst case scenarios. I mean, and I sort of work that out or attempt to work it out, I suppose, a little bit in my fiction. Yeah, so innovating, I have no idea if it's innovative at all. My only hope really is I try to write books that I would want to read, and then hope that there are other people like me who would want to read them.
And there are plenty here tonight who are interested in doing that.
Yeah.
So what common misconceptions or assumptions about horror novels would you like to sort of debunk or clarify?
Oh boy, how much time do we have? It is funny. I mean, when I say it's getting better, I mean, horror definitely has a stigma to it within the wider sort of literary world. I think it's gotten better. I mean, horror is getting taken seriously, quote unquote, seriously a little bit more, I think, than it used to. But because of the success of my novels, which is amazing, I've had the opportunity to go to some literary festivals, not with just horror writers, but with all sorts of writers. And I can't tell you how many times where like I'm talking to somebody, they don't know me, I don't know them, they're a writer. And what do you write, Paul? And like in my head, I'm like, this probably isn't going to go well. And maybe that reflects a little bit of my own insecurities, but half the time I say horror, I'm a horror writer, or I write horror, I see eyes glaze over, or they'll say, oh, I don't read that stuff. And I'm supposed to be like, oh yeah, why would you? I even had an award-winning poet. Like I had a very nice conversation with this poet from the hotel. Like we were in the hotel van being brought to this big festival, giant festival in Los Angeles. Congratulated the poet on winning the award and had this great conversation. And then the poet asked me, oh, what'd you write? I'm like, oh, I write horror. And the poet literally laughed and then turned and started talking to somebody else. I'm like, come on, I'm right here. But also, I mean, those are sort of the negative parts of like what horror is sort of assumed to be. I mean, there's a lot more people who take it seriously too. So I don't want to seem like I'm complaining too much because I've been treated very well. What I think it is, I think the reason why is that, well, I mean, it goes back, I mean, genre in general, like sort of the prejudices against genre in general is really rooted, 100 plus years ago in class, where the pulp books were literally made for workers coming out of factories. And so, the serious people who studied and wrote literature, 100 plus years ago, were the ones who could afford to go to college and talk about the serious literature that each other wrote. And so genre was always initially like, no, that's not good stuff. But I mean, like I said, it is getting taken more seriously. Well, you asked me the question that made me go off on a rant, Stephanie. I guess what I would say though, for the average person, like I think the average person hears horror and they think, oh, Friday the 13th, they think, slasher. I think more than any other genre, horror is associated with maybe its worst representatives. Worst insofar as like, is there some sort of art happening here? It's not to say you can't enjoy horror just for the fun of it. I mean, believe me, Evil Dead 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time. So I get the fun horror aspect. Why I like horror and why I continue to work in it and why I continue to read it and promote it is I think that, well, let me say this, any written story, any work of art really, but any story, there's going to be a reveal of a truth, right? It doesn't have to be horror, but in a story, there's a reveal of some truth as the author sees it. And in a horror story, typically the truth that's revealed is a horrible one, a scary one. And it could be personal, societal, universal. And my favorite horror stories dare to ask like the hardest questions that art can ask after the reveal of the truth. What are the characters going to do now? What decisions are they going to make? Do they know the consequences? How do they live through this? How does anybody live through this? And to me, I think horror can get at some of those stickiest questions in really interesting ways. So that's what I guess I'd probably leave off most of that rant, but just end with the why I like horror part, if someone wanted to know why horror.
Absolutely. Now, going back to location, a little while ago, you talked about some of your own connections and how that led you to make certain choices about the book. So can you tell us a little bit more about why New England for this book?
Sure. I have to admit, I mean, I'm a lifelong New Englander. I grew up in Beverly, Massachusetts, went to Providence College, grad school, UVM. I live in Stoughton now. So I've never really lived outside of New England. So honestly, part of it is I know the area, so I'm going to use it to my advantage. But that said, I mean, there's obviously a long and rich Gothic and folk tradition of horror stories in New England. I mean, even before obviously Stephen King. It's just, for a lot of people, in Western culture, you say New England and a lot of them will think, oh, Gothic, creepy kind of place, which is, it can be. So as a writer, I have the familiarity, which is good because I feel comfortable, but also there's those expectations that I can either lean into or sort of subvert and play with. So I enjoy that aspect of it as well. Yeah, so I don't know, otherwise in Survivor Song, I mean, I sort of, as a writer, I'm a magpie. Like I like to take little bits of almost everything and try to build my own nest that way. So I don't know, Survivor Song, I sort of really lean into the area that I live in, including like the house in the opening of the book and the prelude of the book is the house that I lived in from 1999 to about 2011 or 12. This is partly why my wife, Lisa PC93, doesn't read my books anymore because I'm always taking our lives and making it scary and awful. She said, "Can I come onto the Zoom tonight?" I said, "No, I'm just kidding." She could have come on if she wanted to. Yeah, so I guess that's the New England part of it. I will say that I have a novel that's due to my publisher in May, and there's going to be a chunk of it that happens in Providence. And the main character is going to be a PC student. And the main character is going to talk about his days at Club Babyhead. I don't know if anyone out there ever went to Club Babyhead in the in the 90s. One of my favorite places.
Well, actually, that's a perfect segue because
okay.
Just wondering how your experiences at Providence College have impacted your journey as a writer.
Yeah, so it's funny, even though I jokingly say I was a math major at Providence, and I was. I don't know. I became who I was at Providence. I did not have a good time in high school. I was, very shy. Didn't have a ton of friends, and I found myself at Providence. Which I think is an experience that a lot of people have in college, because I don't know, I figured out that it was okay to be me. It was okay to like the things that I liked. So at Providence, I mentioned I DJ'd at DOM, and so music was a big deal to me. So, I would go to the local shows in Providence, etc. But then, like, unbeknowingly to me at the time, I ended up a math humanities major. A long, boring story, but I started off math ed, but I screwed up something, and then I turned it into a math humanities major. And I took an English class, only one, and it was my second semester senior year, 8:30 in the morning. That was tough. But it was essentially English 101. And I was like the only senior in there, and the rest were freshmen. But, I was a math major who took a few history and philosophy classes. I wasn't an English major. In fact, so I mentioned Lisa already. Lisa Carol Tremblay, she was an English major, and I would obnoxiously make fun of her, like, oh, you English majors, you just make it up as you all go. Math, we have answers. It's a wonder that she still dated me and then married me. So anyway, so I took this English course with Professor McLaughlin, and I've been trying to find him for years. If anyone knows where Professor McLaughlin is, please let me know, because I want to thank him. I had one of those almost like, Dead Poet Society experiences in his class. He was just a really engaging teacher, and he was a big punk fan, which helped me because I was a big punk fan. So every paper I wrote for him was comparing some story that I wrote to like a punk song. And he'd be like, oh yeah, this is great, keep doing it. But in that class, I'll never forget reading the short story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates. So I'll never forget putting that story down after reading it and going, oh, I didn't know people wrote things like this. And so after that class, I graduated. Lisa bought me Stephen King's The Stand for my birthday. I have a summer birthday. So really it was the combination of Professor McLaughlin's class and reading The Stand that I went up to Vermont for 2 years and struggled by the skin of my teeth to get my master's. But I fell in love with reading when I was up at Vermont because of the start that I got at Providence.
It's a great story, and hopefully we'll be able to, when we get into our open session, we'll be able to hear maybe some similar experiences that people would like to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was your strategy in organizing the story of Survivor Song? And how would you say that the arrangement in particular helps readers to understand and keep up with the storyline?
So I think the biggest thing was a decision early on to keep it like really to the two characters' point of view, Romola and Natalie, and to tell the story over 4 to 6 hours. I felt like that was sort of its own sort of like, ticking clock built into the story, which I hope, would help drag the readers along. Besides the fact, and if you haven't read it yet, this isn't a huge spoiler. It happens in the first 20 pages. But, when Natalie's husband is killed and she is bit by the rabid neighbor or individual, the reader knows, oh, she doesn't have a lot of time. So there's that ticking clock that's really just built into the story. So even if I like go off to the side and give a little character detail to fill in, the reader at the back of their head's like, oh, all right, come on. We know we only have like, this timeline is there. So that was a big part of the structuring of the story for me. The other part, the prelude, interlude, and postlude in particular, even though in the very beginning of the novel I say this isn't a fairy tale, this is a song. I'm sort of like being a little bit cheeky with that because I make so many references to fairy tales throughout the book. And the publisher, which I thought was very cool of them, even made those 3 sections of the book look like a storybook kind of set up with a different font and a different look to the pages.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone picked it up, and I don't necessarily expect people to have picked it up, but like when someone is fully infected by the virus, they're speaking gibberish sort of, or weird lines, but the gibberish that they speak are actually lines from Grimm's fairy tales. So for a lot of the book, I was playing with, this is not a fairy tale, but still making references to fairy tales. So I don't know. I mean, that was the structure I was thinking of. Again, trying to think like, I want to keep this like a song. I want it to be quick, but I want it to be like really emotional too. Yeah, I think I answered the question.
Absolutely. And actually, Speaking of emotion, the book does feel quite personal, and there's definitely a thread of hope and some endearing moments, between the characters and throughout. How do you think this could connect to the current pandemic and life in 2020, where there's been lots of ups and downs?
So, one of the strangest parts for me, living through this pandemic was, I wrote this book beforehand. And there's probably only like 2 or 3 people in the world, like my editor and my sister, probably them two, and that's it, who read the book before the coronavirus hit. So, I have no idea. I wonder what readers would have thought, if they had read this without any, coronavirus happening. So, I mean, no matter what, even though I didn't write it during 2020, it's always going to be thought of as this 2020 novel, which is fine. It's a little strange to me. I do think there's a thread of hope. And actually, my view of the book is, it's changed completely since the coronavirus. But one of the things that has changed is when I first wrote the book, and I won't get spoilery, I thought the prelude was more of a downer, more of a minor horror before coronavirus hit, as opposed to after. Now that it's hit after, I think the prelude is much more hopeful than I initially thought it was. One of the other things that I put in the book that I do think hopefully people can take, some hope from is, and this is not a spoiler, I write in the book at one point that, this virus is not the end of the world. It's not the apocalypse. People are going to go on. That was sort of one of the messages that I had in the book. And this came from some conversations that I had with another writer friend she's just brilliant. Her name is Nadia Balkan. She grew up in Jakarta. So she experienced firsthand, a political apocalypse, really. The country is just torn apart in the late early 90s, mid 90s, somewhere in there. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the time frame. But she would talk to me about how there's obviously that apocalyptic fear has been in the zeitgeist ever really since the turn of the millennium, right? All the explosion of all these zombie movies, The Walking Dead, and all the worries about climate change, all very very rational fears. But her point to me as someone who she has a master's in political science and political cultures as well. The thing I found fascinating talking to her, she would talk about is society is a lot more resilient than people think, short of an asteroid or short of everyone lobs their nuclear bombs at once. Things get bad. Not everyone's going to survive, but the society itself tends to move on. She's like, you'd be surprised that if you look beyond, obviously, the United States or even just beyond this hemisphere, what some countries have gone through, economic collapse, political collapses, but still, those countries are still there. And that was sort of ringing in my head when I was writing Survivor Song, because I kind of felt like that would even make it a little bit more poignant. The idea that, hey, if some of the characters who don't make it, if they could have held on for another couple of weeks or a month or 6 months or however long, they would have been able to make it. So I don't know. I guess that's a little depressing too, but I don't know, just the idea of people, what it looks like to fight, what it looks like to survive. That was sort of the things I was thinking about with Survivor Song.
That's really powerful. And one of the things we're wondering about with so many fans on the call tonight is how to sink into more of your writing. You mentioned that you do have a book in the works, and also are wondering what advice you'd have for anyone that's considering getting into the writing world.
Sure. So, my website's paultremblay.net. I'm on Twitter, Paul G. Tremblay, and Instagram as well. My brain just went blank. On my previous novel, so I'm sort of I'm the horror writer for my publisher now, although my first 2 novels that were published in 2009 and 2010 were sort of quirky crime novels, where they featured a narcoleptic private detective in South Boston. Still kind of dark, but also more on the humorous side. Those books are actually going to be re-released in 2021 because that was with a different publisher, so that's kind of fun. But I mentioned some of my other books before that are out there, A Head Full of Ghosts and The Cabinet at the End of the World. And I will be obnoxious and say that Stephen King said about A Head Full of Ghosts that it scared the living hell out of him. I had that tattooed on my back. I wasn't going to take off my shirt, I promise. But no, it's just that Stephen King has been a reader and so supportive of my stuff still just blows me away.
Excellent.
Yeah. So as far as writing advice goes, especially I'd say for all writers, for new writers, I think the hardest thing in the world to do is to be patient. And it's only getting there are so many writer communities online and Twitter and Facebook. And I feel the pressure too. Like I go on Twitter and I see all these different writers talking about all this amazing stuff they're doing. And you just start feeling anxiety and like, oh, I have to be like them. I have to do this. And then maybe like you self-publish something that's not ready or something like that. So my thing would be even though it doesn't feel like you can be patient, patience is, I think, is the writer's biggest ally. And after that, really, you just have to do the work. You have to read a ton, do the work, and be patient. I mean, it's okay to get rejections. You're going to get rejected. I still get rejections for short fiction. And I think a lot of whatever success I've had is me just sort of like dumbly keeping my head down and just pushing forward and just trying the next book and the next book after that. I mentioned my detective novels. Those are my first novels that were published, but The Little Sleep was the 4th and a half novel that I'd written. 2.5 other novels never saw the light of day. One I published later. It's hard to write a whole novel and like have it not be out there, but I still know that novel did its job. It helped push me further down along where I was a better writer when I started figuring out how to write a novel. Like everything you write is gonna help you, even if it doesn't get published right off the bat.
Patience is very important when you're a writer.
Absolutely.
And in general.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for opening us up with these really great insights into your process, into your journey, and it's been really inspiring.
Thanks.
So thank you. So at this point, we're hoping, to open things up for folks to either put questions in the chat, or if you have questions that you want to ask in general.
Maybe if they raise their hand, maybe we can see them. If you don't ask questions, I will ask math questions. You don't want that, trust me.
Hey, Paul.
So Dan's hand go up. Oh, hi, Linda.
Sorry, I'm trying to learn how to put my hand up. Take the other question first.
No, sorry, go ahead. I know Dan, so I'll get Dan after you.
I can answer the math questions. If you ask math questions, I'll answer.
I do WebEx every day. I don't do Zoom, so I can't find my little hand. Well, our group is so proud of you, Paul, for everything.
Thank you.
I'm a class of 93, friends with Paul and Lisa, and working in education myself at a college, and you working in a high school. I was wondering if you do book clubs with your own students, and how over the years, teenagers process your books compared to adults, and especially with what's going on in the world today with the pandemic and resilience, and kids are more resilient than all of us, I think. If you've noticed any changes in the conversations.
Wow, it's a great question. So one, I don't do book clubs with my kids at school. I have started a creative writing club though, which has been kind of fun. It's funny, I get asked all the time because like horror fans are like, oh, I would love to have you as a math teacher. I'm like, you probably wouldn't. I'm kind of strict. Like, don't the kids think you're cool? I'm like, no, I'm their math teacher. I mean, I've printed out Stephen King's tweets and have them up on the wall. I'm not like hiding from that stuff. But like in my lowest moment as a teacher, I've said to a class that was like ignoring me or giving me grief, I'd be like, hey, outside of this place, people think I'm cool. And they're like, no. Yeah, so it is a little weird. Like you can tell the kids are somewhat interested. I mean, I teach at an all boys school. So in some ways, some of these, a lot of them, not all of them, but a significant portion of them are sort of stereotypical boys at a certain age where it's uncool to seem like you're trying hard. It's uncool to seem like you're smart, which is a weird thing to say, but think of freshmen, sophomore boys, especially. But they're interested in like the Hollywood side of things, and I definitely talk about the books. And every Halloween, I don't teach math. I'll read something really scary and try to disturb them, which is kind of fun. I haven't been fired yet, knock on wood. So in terms of their resilience, that's a hard question. One of the reasons why I continue to teach and every year I think about, do I quit teaching? And I think about it, and I just keep doing it. Is that, I really do like working with students of that age, because they help me as a writer. They've been a wonderful lesson in voice, like the slang that those guys have, for one thing, that age group has. And there's also like a subset of their slang that they've taken and made like that's school specific. So another good advice for writers when you have published stuff is don't read all your reviews, which I've broken sometimes. But for a couple of my novels where I had some teenage boys, I borrowed the lingo at my school, and it sort of cracks me up. I've seen some reviews of people like, oh, for my novel, Disappearance at Devil's Rock, there were 3 13-year-old boys. And they're like, oh, those teenagers are so annoying. It's like, yeah, 13-year-old boys are really annoying. I mean, that was what I was going for. Yeah. So anyway, no, I mean, they help keep me young and thinking young, I think. And I would certainly not say I'm totally up on all the youth culture, but at least I get to be on the outside and glean a little pieces of it. Although I just had, with my creative writing club, I just had a woman that I know who writes for video games. And so I figured the kids would be really interested in that. And they ended up just all making fun of me because I asked if everyone had Steam or used Steam. And apparently that was a dumb question. It's like, what do you mean? Everyone uses Steam. I'm like, sorry. And so, yeah. So I was, again, the uncool math teacher.
I'm a daughter of a math teacher, so I understand. Great answer. Thank you.
Dan, did you have a question, or you were just going to say you could answer the math?
Just bragging. No, no. Actually, I do have a question for you, actually, and this might seem like an odd question to ask in a book club discussion, but I happen to know a couple of your books are in the middle of movie adaptations. I'm wondering what the status is of those. Sure.
So my novel, A Head Full of Ghosts, which came out in 2015, that one's by far the closest to being a thing. And if COVID hadn't happened, it would have filmed this past summer. Again, there are much bigger problems in the world than that. So it's in sort of like this weird precarious position where it could film as soon as things sort of ease up, hopefully in spring of 2021, or it could totally fall apart. And that's sort of been my experience with Hollywood. It's been very frustrating. But for that movie, they have a director, Scott Cooper. He made Black Mass, the Johnny Depp Whitey Bulger movie. He made Desert Heart with Jeff Bridges. So I mean, he's a legit director, and they have some casting too. My novel, A Cabin at the End of the World, has been optioned, but it doesn't seem like much is happening with it. And at this point, I would rather just have the rights back, because I read the screenplay and I hated it so much. I think I slept 2 hours that night. And I have no official say in that stuff. And Survivor Song hasn't been announced yet, but we're in the process of getting the contract ready to be signed. So an option is a production company basically just rents like 18 months exclusive access to your work. And they don't buy the film rights until the day they start filming. Because buying the film rights is a big check. That's a big deal. And Hollywood productions can stop like the day before filming. I had a friend, this is the last story, and then we'll go to another question. But I had a friend, Chuck Wendig is his name. He had a series of books and was going to be a television show on Starz, to the point where he was going to be a writer, he was going to be a producer. He had a physical office. There was an office building with an office for his TV show. And that was on Friday. And on Sunday night, they're like, oh, sorry, we're not doing the show. And they're like, Neil Gaiman's American Gods moved into those same offices the next day. So, yeah. So, I mean, it's exciting to talk about the possibilities, but nothing's set in stone until the day they start filming. So hopefully, I feel like we're getting somewhat closer. But
do you get a cameo?
I hope so. I mean, they told me I'd probably get to go to the set, but again, who knows if they're trying to make a movie during coronavirus or not. So we'll see. I would like a cameo. Believe me.
I have a question.
Hi, sure.
Hi, I'm Jill.
Hi, Jill.
Hi. I wanted to say two things. I have a question. Well, I want to tell you something, and then I have a question. So, I loved Devil's Rock, the disappearance of Devil's Rock. I must say, I grew up in Easton. So,
okay.
Borderland was right. This is the setting of the book. Okay, it's a state park. It's Borderland State Park. So I was like, oh, Devil's Rock, that sounds like Borderland. And then I like picked it up and I was like, oh my God, like I grew up on Rockland Street. Like I was like, you're like talking about the kids walking down the street. And I was like, oh my God. So I love that book. And then I loved Cabin at the End of the World, or is it House at the End of the World?
Yeah, Cabin at the End of the World.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I love that. I read that in one sitting. I thought it was fabulous.
Thanks.
It was so good. And I didn't really sleep. But and then my second question is, I didn't know you had a new book. I'm really excited. Now I'm gonna go read it. But my second question is, so I'm a writer. I was an English major at PC, but again, I write about boring stuff. I write about architecture and systems, technical systems, so that regular people can understand it. So anyway, but how do you get like the guts to like submit something? Like I think that's like a lot of chutzpah. Like good for you, and like obviously it worked out for you. But how do you kind of just like get over that, like, and not just put your novel in a shoebox? Like how do you do that?
Yeah, well, I started just writing short stories in the mid 90s. Okay. You know, and the nice thing with horror that there is like sort of an online community of readers and writers, and there are smaller markets too, like, you know, little magazines or webzines that probably only pay like $10 to $20 for a story. Yeah. So that's kind of how I started. I would write a short story and send it to these different magazines. You know, so I got used to rejection right away, which was fine. Yeah. Like I wasn't expecting right off the bat to start selling. Yeah. You know, it is definitely harder to get rejections with novels. Like in 2003, I wrote this novel called Phobia. And it wasn't horror. It was sort of a goofy comedy in Boston. Yeah. About a character who had the fear of the inability to complete simple tasks. And it was, I don't know, just like this, you know, goofy fun kind of.
Yeah.
And I spent 2 years trying to find an agent. I got hundreds of rejects. I kept going though, because a lot of the rejects were like, wow, this is really funny and original. I just don't know who to sell this to. And that would actually kind of firing me up a little bit. Like, well, isn't that your job? Like I did the hard part. So I just sort of stupidly or dumbly I just kept submitting. You know, and I finally got an agent in 2006. You know, again, it only takes one. Yeah. We were unable to sell that book, but now I have my agent in place. And really, that's a big deal. Like once I have my agent in place, like after like 10 plus years of all these rejects and struggling, I had my agent in place. I started The Little Sleep, my detective novel, in April of 2007. Finished it in August of 2007, which was insane. Like I've never come close to writing a book that quickly since. You know, when he sold it a month later. But, you know, none of that would have happened if I didn't have the agent in place. So I don't know, like, I think, again, part of it was like, you know, I think all of us, it depends on your age. Like you get to a certain age where you like, you care less about what other people think of you, right? Yeah. Whereas you used to totally obsess over it. And I think with me, that was tied into, he's like, oh, you know what? It's okay to like things. You know, and the internet tries to kill that in you now. You know, especially Twitter, right? Like you post, I like this movie, and people just like jump on you, or, you know, but like, it's okay to like things. It's okay to be passionate about them. And I don't know, the things I like, I try to do. I mean, cause it's kind of fun. Like I actually tried to be a musician before being a writer, but I figured out pretty quickly I was a better writer than a musician. I mean, I still hack around on my guitar, you know, just for fun. Yeah. But oh, that was part of it. It was like, oh, I really like what I'm reading. Like, I want to try that, you know, and see what happens. But thanks. And the last thing I would say, Jill, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there's another Borderlands scene in here, and there might be a connection to Disappearance of Devil's Rock in that book too.
Oh my God, I'm gonna have to read it.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Thank you. Yeah. And I have one last question. Who's your favorite writer?
Who's my favorite writer? That's hard. I have so many. I mean, Stephen King obviously means the world to me because I started reading because of him. Yeah. I don't know. Peter Straub's another favorite. Shirley Jackson. I really love her work. Yeah. For newer writers, I mean, there are so many newer horror writers right now. I think we sort of are in a golden age of horror writing where there's you know, so many different types of horror writers, and you know, or different types of stories they're writing. So I don't know. It's hard to pick a favorite. I part of my job as a writer, you know, I said you have to read. You know, I read 60 to 80 novels a year is how it works out usually. You know, a little more than one a week. Yeah. And I feel like that's how I learned how to write, was by basically mimicking other writers. So like, and if I'm not reading, I feel like I'm getting dumber, or at least my writing's getting worse. So I have to read. It's part of my, you know, it's part of what I have to do as a writer.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I piggyback off? Jill's question.
Sure, and then we'll ask JW after, yeah.
Hi, this is Jessica. I'm class
Hi,
of
Jessica.
2003. Hi, thanks for your time tonight. This has been so interesting.
Oh, thanks for
I
coming.
love all of your books and loved your books even more knowing that you were a PC graduate. That was pretty amazing. My sister-in-law was also a math major at PC.
Oh, really?
But I wanted to ask a question. When I read Head Full of Ghosts, my twin sister and I read it at the same time, and we both said that it was the first book that made us physically lose sleep and not want to get out of bed. I have a very overactive imagination, and the line that you said before about Stephen King is, well, it's like, ooh, if he thinks this is scary, maybe
Right.
I'll take a try at it. So I'm extremely impressive. I can't wait for the movie to come out. I probably won't be able to sleep again for a month, but the question I have for you is, what books or stories have you read that kind of make you feel that same way, where it kind of just really, really stays with you well after you read it?
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you. There's so many. So like, there's a book called House of Leaves that was published in like 2000. That book's a really big undertaking because there's a lot of like typographical and postmodern tricks to it. And you have to have like 4 or 5 bookmarks going because you'll be reading a section, and the footnote will send you like to the appendix, and it's about this house that forever expands. That in the book is almost like the same way. So I mean, talk about a book that just like affects your head. Like it just makes you sort of question everything that you're doing. So that's a book that definitely had a big effect on me. I would say most recently, one of my favorite short story collections that just came out within the last couple of years is called Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. She's Argentinian. And the stories are all so different. There's like, there's like a Lovecraftian story, there's ghost stories, there's like Shirley Jackson stories, a lot of stories that deal with the sociopolitics in Argentina. But the first story in that collection, The Dirty Kid, was so disturbing. And not like in a torture porn kind of way, but just so like, yeah, it just scared me, unnerved me to no end. Like it's the kind of story where I'll just find myself randomly thinking about it, even now, like years later, like somewhere. So that would be a big recommendation.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I think I saw a hand up with JW.
Hi, Paul. My name is Jim. I was just
Jim.
curious, what was such a defining moment about where are you going, where have you been that stuck with you from your days at Providence?
I think initially it was just like, I don't know, like, so I was joking earlier with Duncan, who's in school now here, about Western Civ, right? I don't know, as a math major, like, reading the stuff that we had to read in Western Civ just seemed like very dry to me. And, even the stuff we read in high school, nothing really connected with me that much. But, reading the Joyce Carol Oates story, there just seemed to be so much menace and possibility, but a lot of it was like unsaid and was sort of underneath everything. It was quite ambiguous too. There's a question as to whether Arnold's friend is an old fiend. Like there's, a few passages where Oates, says his like cowboy boots look like the feet are too small. So maybe it's hooves or something in there. So, I mean, not for me, that story also was probably like an ambiguous one that really stuck with me. Cause I know like I write a lot of ambiguous supernatural horror stories. So I don't know. And a lot of that story just hinges on these 2 characters. I'm so bad with character names. Other than, Arnold's friend, this older person who's trying to convince a 16-year-old girl to come out, leave her house and go for a ride with him. So there's that, inherent suspense right there because she shouldn't go. But at the same time, like how as a teenager, how you think and like you want adventure, etc. It's just really, really well done and really disturbing and and holds up amazingly. I would definitely recommend it. In fact, Jill, not to go back, The Disappearance of Devil's Rock, sort of the villain character is named somewhat after a character in that Joyce Carol Oates story.
Okay. Yeah, he's creepy. And I love that short story. It's one of my favorite short stories.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I was always like, creep me out so much. The ambiguity of it, pretty much.
Yeah. Any other questions? Sarah?
Hi, Paul. So I'm class of '03, but also obviously work in the Alumni Relations office. So thank you for being with us tonight. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you gave Paul and I think it was Paul and Lewis in the book? And I thought it was interesting how you kind of stopped the other story to kind of complete their journey. So, did you consider them heroes in the book?
Yeah, so those two teenage boy characters that show up in Survivor Song, initially, when I was writing the book, I knew that I was going to have a scene where, the two women sort of hit the road sort of thing. And it's like, I need a little bit of comic relief, a little bit of breaking the tension. It's like, I want these teenagers who are sort of zombie experts to also like to represent the readers who have, know everything about zombies. Like I thought it would be realistic that people would be comparing what was going on to zombies, even though they're not real zombies. I mean, we saw it when COVID first hit. Like everybody on Twitter was like, oh, it's like The Stand. And Stephen King was like, it's not like The Stand. So part of it was their role was going to be, their initial role was a little bit of comic relief. They're the zombie experts. But when I got deeper into the book, I enjoyed that I had now two friendships to compare, because Survivor Song in my head in a lot of ways is a friendship novel, the friendship between, Romola and Natalie, and how different that is compared to like a romantic relationship, how different that is from a familial relationship, right? Because, friends get to choose each other, like brothers and sisters don't get to choose each other, obviously, and there can be ebbs and flows, especially in a long friendship. So anyway, I like the idea of Josh and Luis. They're obviously, very young, 17, 18-year-olds, their friendship compared to Natalie and Romola's, which is a lot of, Natalie and Romola's was more mature, obviously, but at the same time, I don't know, I feel like I could imagine Josh and Luis acting like probably Romola and Natalie did when they were first friends, that really intense friendship when you first become friends. So as far as like Josh and Luis's role in the interlude, I had read this book. Someone asked who's a favorite writer. Another contemporary writer that I love, he's not a horror writer, is Patrick DeWitt. He writes sort of like dry humor novels. He wrote The Sisters Brothers. I don't know if anyone's have read that. It's a very funny story. And he wrote this novel called Major Domo Minor. In the middle of this novel, I mean, there's major characters, but in the middle of this novel, he does an interlude with this one little side character. And I thought it was just so beautiful. I was like, oh, I want to do that someday. And I put that sort of way in the back of my head that I wanted to do that. That was part of the reason why I wanted to have their story finish, or their story continue or be told in Survivor Song.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Duncan, you got a question?
Yes. So you said earlier that horror is often associated with its worst representatives. So I was wondering, what do you think makes a good horror representative, and what makes a bad representative of horror?
Well, I mean, like on just even like a story level, I think, everyone's seen that Geico commercial where like it's a horror movie and like the teenager's like, oh, we should hide here, go in the car. What are you, stupid? No, hide behind the chainsaws, right? Yeah. So it's sort of like a running joke that horror characters are dumb. And they are often in the worst representations of horror, and I have no interest in that. Like, I want my characters to be smart, to be complicated, and to try to approach things realistically. I also think I would lump all my favorite horror stories. I talked about that reveal of a truth earlier. And my favorite horror stories, I think, follow a progressive. And I'm not talking politically necessarily, but in terms of the story, how it's constructed is progressive as opposed to reactionary. And what I mean by that is, in a horror story, the truth is revealed. I typically try to do like the big horror thing about 2/3 of the way through and then show what happens after, because everyone who goes through that reveal is going to be changed, fundamentally changed. And I think there are all of the sort of the bad, what I would call like not good horror representation. All those stories tend to be very reactionary, meaning like, oh, the other comes to the town and has to be defeated. And then everyone's happy, right? And that's a very reactionary, aside from other political issues with that kind of story too. But it's a very reactionary structure, the idea that you can restore the status quo, whereas there's no way you could restore the status quo. I mean, that's the truth of existence. Everything changes. Everything you experience is going to change you. You can't go back, even if you wanted to go back, and we probably shouldn't want to go back. So in my favorite horror stories, it represents the fact that people are going to be fundamentally changed by what happened. It's part of the reason why I wrote A Head Full of Ghosts, is because the ending to me of The Exorcist, as amazing and as scary as The Exorcist is a failure. And when I say the ending, it's really the post ending. You know, spoiler alert on The Exorcist, but after Father Karras tumbles down the stairs, right? The movie ends with it's sunlight, Reagan, the little girl who was possessed, has no memory of what happened. Her mother's happy, everyone's happy. And then the movie ends like, no, those people who went through that would be scarred and fundamentally changed for life. So like, no, I'm going to write a possession story where the attempted exorcism happens about 2/3 of the way through. I want to know what happens after. Like, well, what the hell did the family do now after that happens? So yeah, so that's what for me, those are the horror stories that work.
Thanks.
That was really preachy. Sorry. Anything else? Anything PC related? I saw some shout outs for Baby. I actually just bought a Baby Head t-shirt, but it's like a replica of a Baby Head t-shirt, Mark. It's not an original, unfortunately.
I don't have the original either. I did see an original because I had a place up in Providence until recently. I haven't been able to go back, but there was a place that was selling a living room t-shirt, arcade original, but it was like $230. But I damn near bought it.
It's the perfect name for like a punk club though, Club Baby Head. It was great.
It was.
I love that place.
It was.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One more question, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
How do you sort of, when you're writing, like, what's your jam for writing? Like, do you write in the morning? Do you write at night? Do you put on your headphones and zone out and listen to music, or like, and then like when you get stuck, what do you do? Like, do you go for a run? Do you go for a walk the dog, whatever? Like, what's kind of your like habit? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. So like I didn't start writing until I started teaching. So I've always been sort of like a part of that schedule. So I get more done in the spring and the summer than I do in the fall and the winter, which are my busier times at school. When, my son was born in 2000, and oddly enough, like the birth of him was when I sold my first professional sale. It was a short story for like 3 cents a word. So then I sort of learned like a good time management lesson. Like if my son was going to nap for 45 minutes, I was going to sit and write for 45 minutes. I didn't have time to try to like ease my way into it or come up with writing rituals some people talk about. For me, it was like, nope, open laptop, write. Like I used to when kids were taking a quiz, they could have been cheating. I had no idea. I was working on a story. As I've gotten older and as like having to be online has taken over more of my writing life, which is a little bit unfortunate. Like you kind of have to, if you're going to be public, if you've got published stuff, you almost have to be on Twitter and on Instagram. It's almost like part of the deal now.
Yeah.
To help sell books. So that takes up more of my time than I would like. So typically I'm writing at night now if it's during the school year, but like on the weekends I'll get up in the morning and write. But I do a lot of writing like when I'm not writing, which sounds stupid, but like especially if I'm writing a novel, I'm just always thinking about it.
Yeah.
And if I get stuck, oddly enough, what helps me is all my best ideas, all my best fixes, if there's a problem, happen in the shower or in the bathroom. And honestly, I've heard so many writers say that, and they're like, oh, it's something about the ionized air, like, the steam and the water. It's like, I don't know. I think it's more that for whatever reason, my unconscious has now been trained to be like, okay, you're in the shower. This is when you think and solve problems.
Funny.
But the other question about, I used to prefer writing in silence.
Yeah.
And I would only put on headphones and music if there was noise around, because, my office is just off the kitchen and those are just curtains. It's not like I can shut the door. So if stuff's going on in the house, I'll put on music and then I can write. So now I kind of almost I feel like I've by mistake trained myself to have music to write. So, but I can't write to music with lyrics. It has to be
Like
instrumental. So I'm usually doing movie soundtracks. Usually probably creepy soundtracks. Like I've been using The Witch a lot. A 1990 movie called Ravenous. Oh, that's a really good soundtrack. That's like an hour. So I know, like, all right, I'll put this on. I have an hour, and when it's end, I'm like, okay, I did my hour.
Oh my God. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Funny.
So ahead of our call tonight, we did get our hands on a few copies of Survivor Song, which Paul graciously signed for us. We gave away the first one in our alumni Facebook group to Bill Howard, who was on the call earlier. He must have had to hop off. But we still have two more. So I didn't know if Paul, maybe you wanted to, maybe quiz the group and this person to write their answer in the chat, or however you want to test the group on their Survivor Song knowledge.
Yeah, and remind me of his name after, because I haven't signed them yet. I'll mail them tomorrow, but I can personalize them too to the person as opposed to just signing them. All right, so you have to type it in the chat first. The first person who types the answer in the chat. I'll do one question about Survivor Song, and then I'll do I don't know, maybe a question about an older book. Just I don't know, we'll see.
Yep. Okay.
So in Survivor Song, what's the name of Natalie's husband who dies horribly in the beginning? What's the first name of the husband that dies horribly? Oh, Andrea was super fast. Paul, me, yes. Congratulations. Although it wasn't me, because the Paul described in the book was like 5'10". I'm 6'4". That's my excuse anyway. Oh, another question. Or maybe I should ask you a PC question. Well, I was going to ask a head full of ghost questions, but is there really only one person who's read a head full of ghosts? I don't want to like just be like, hey, here's the book. Oh shoot, I'm on.
Maybe do a PC question.
Okay. All right, so this is going to be for older people though too. I was going to ask for the name of the record store on Thayer Street, or there were two record stores on Thayer Street for a long time, but oh no, under pressure and I'm failing miserably.
Yes, Newbury Comics.
No, I was thinking of Tom's Tracks. Mark Hafner, you remember Tom's Tracks or In Your Ear? All right, I got to think of a different question here.
Yeah. Goldie's was on Thayer Street though, but that was on there too. That was upstairs.
Oh, was there? Oh, that maybe that was a little bit after me. Sorry.
The bouncer that worked in the living room worked at Goldie's.
If you're stumped, Paul, we could always do a whole name out of the hat too, and one lucky one.
Yeah, let's do random, because I don't want to. I have nothing.
It's all good. We'll pick somebody and we'll shoot you off the names, and we can get you those to send back to us, and then we'll get them to their rightful owners.
Great. Any other questions? I mean, don't feel like you have to stay, but if you have questions, I'll be happy to ask or to answer. Excuse me. If you want me to ask you questions, that might be weird, but. Well, thank you everybody for coming. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out on Facebook. You're all PC grads. I trust you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And thank you all too for joining us. We started the book club in around July, and Stephanie has been moderating us over the last couple months. So we do a book about every month or every other month, depending on what the schedule is for our other activities. But we hope that you join us again.
They all online or like forever, or what is it?
For right now, all of our discussions are online. Yeah. There's a Facebook group that's linked to the alumni account where we generate some discussion through there and announce the next book. But then all of our discussions are done on Zoom.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for doing
Yeah,
it.
thank you. Yeah, thanks for setting this up.
Thanks,
That's great.
everyone. Go Friars.
Thank you.
Yeah, go Friars.
Thank you for listening to the Providence College Podcast. Episodes are available in all of the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. For producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.